Well, welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to have Tim Brady here with us. Tim got his PhD from MIT working with Odoliva, and then he did a postdoc in the same city with George Alvarez with a closely collaborating lab at Harvard. And then he has been he has been at UCSD since 2015, I think, if I remember correctly. And he heads the Vision and Memory Lab there, doing extraordinarily exciting work about visual memory representation, and he kind of holds the torch for how much we can learn about the brain and the mind just by doing behavioral experiments and computation carefully. So over to you, Tim.
Great. Um, Meeting's recording thing popped up. Okay, hopefully this view is okay with everyone. I can adapt as we go. So I'm going to start by just saying, of course, all this work is done with my whole lab. Here are some of the people. We do a wide variety of work that I won't tell you about today. We have a bunch of people who are interested in mathematical models of attention and memory, which I will tell you a little bit about, but also people studying hearing and how we integrate hearing and vision. Perceptual expertise, we're interested in like radiology and how their perceptual expertise shapes their memory and vision. Data visualization and visual ensemble perception. And a bunch of neural measures of working memory that I won't directly tell you about today. I'll sort of tell you about neurally inspired models, but not the actual neural data. But yeah, anyway, we have a bunch of people. They do great work. If you are interested, we do have a YouTube channel if you end up feeling like you want to, learn more about all this stuff later. Today, I'll try to talk to you about memory for perceptual features. So asking people to remember very precise visual perceptual features as a case study of like studying how we do mental representation more broadly. And I'll introduce you to some tasks that cut across a lot of different literatures in psychology and neuroscience. And I'll introduce you to the way people have thought about those tasks. And then I'll suggest a different way of thinking about it that will have something to do with population codes and sort of high dimensional geometry, which I'll touch on a little bit. That's the idea for today. I'll start by just saying that probably in everyday life, you all probably constantly use physical metaphors for memory. You say that you've lost something or that you can't hold it in mind or all sorts of ideas that are physical. Many people have proposed different physical metaphors for memories. These are the list from a paper with some of the famous physical metaphors for memory. Plato famously said that it was like a wax stamp that you stamp into your book and then you look back at the book later. I like this quote from Arthur Conan Doyle from Sherlock Holmes. I consider that a man's brain is like a little empty attic and you have to stock it with such furniture as you choose, which is, similarly like the idea that we're sort of storing stuff away. And I think the physical metaphors work great. We use them all the time. But I think that because we tend to think about memory as this sort of physical way, like you're sort of holding it or you're not, you sort of have it or you don't, that it leads us to make both mathematical and cognitive models of memory that are fundamentally sort of lead us wrong. And one of those ways is that by default, people, I put people in quotes because I'm including me, tend to talk about memory as though items are sort of either remembered or forgotten completely. Like I see this couch, and then like sometime later I either have it in my mind or I don't. Like I remember it or I forgot it. And I have a paper about how much we can store in long-term memory. It says things like, after seeing 1,000 vivid pictures, observers remembered 992 of them, as though this is quite literally true, right? As though we can count how many things people remember. And this literature is just filled with like really simple mathematical models of how many things people must be holding in mind, depending on how many things they remember. So if you count how often people get it, which one of these two things did you see correct? Then you can say, well, they get some of them correct because they're guessing and they didn't really know, and they get some of them correct because they really did know, and then you can make a little number k that says how many they remember. And this is common if you're thinking about it as all or none. The working memory literature, where we ask people to remember stuff in short-term memory, is just filled with this. Something like 90% of all working memory papers do some version of this thing where they say, look, you can show someone 6 little colored circles, and they only hold in mind 3. Working memory capacity is 3. and the other 3 get lost. And then they do simple mathematical models that say how many things people are holding in mind, and they correlate with that with intelligence and lots of other stuff. And so you've probably heard of this idea of like, you can remember 7 plus or minus 2 things or something, right? These are all based on this sort of intuitive mental model that like you hold some of it, like people literally say hold, like you hold 7 things in mind and you can't hold anymore. So again, like as though you're like holding your mug or not holding it, right? And this is like a physical metaphor for mind. I think it's appealing and intuitive. And what I'm going to try to do is convince you that it shouldn't be your default metaphor for memory, that it shouldn't be like all or none physical things. Instead, we're going to argue something more like, somewhere in your mind, you've got some tuning functions for, say, an orientation. You've got some oriented information, and, in V1, you've got, some orientation that you're seeing. It's going to activate some of these tuning functions and not others. You're going to have something like a population representation. And that, broadly speaking, this sort of idea that really memories are always going to be high dimensional. They're always going to be like the representation of how activated each of these tuning functions is, like in a population code, is actually going to be like a more useful intuition. I say this as someone who's deeply cognitive and studies mostly behavior. Like, in fact, I think I've always found it like odd when people appeal to neuroscience for behavioral models. And yet now here I am being one of those people because I think this leads us the right way, the right intuitions. And the idea is that we can rethink representations of even really simple things as richer than just like, I remember it was orientation 97, and instead I think I remember it as a population representation. And I'll sort of motivate this way of thinking and what it gets us. I'll start by making you guys do a little working memory task on your own here. And the idea is to think about perceptual memory, broadly speaking, how we quantify it, and the sort of error patterns when you make people do perceptual memory tasks. So there are thousands of papers in the literature where people ask you to remember some very simple stimuli for a short amount of time. Here, I'll ask you to remember some shapes. I'll flash them up for just 1 second, and then I'll ask you to reproduce exactly what shape you saw in a little circle you'll see. Okay, so here's some placeholder squares. Now, briefly, a shape flashes up, disappears. We ask how much you can hold in your mind about it. We cue that location. In this case, only 1 shape appeared. And then we say, okay, tell us exactly what shape that was on this little wheel. And as you move your mouse around, it changes what shape you're selecting. And you might select a particular shape as the one you remembered. So this little X here. And that would, show you this shape. We can do this in a much harder way where we make you remember more than 1 shape. So here I'll show you a bunch and then I'll cue just 1. So if we ask you to remember all 6 of these shapes at once, we flash them up briefly, and then we say, hey, what shape was there on the same wheel? You probably now find it pretty challenging. And you might select right there. That was, I think, the correct answer. And probably most of you couldn't hold in mind 6 things. That on its own is pretty interesting, right? The idea that you can't hold in mind 6 things that just like I asked you to keep holding them and you couldn't do it. And when we do this task, we find, in fact, people kind of stink at doing it with 6, but they're pretty good at doing it with 1. And we can quantify error here really nicely. It's not just, did you get it correct or not correct? Instead, we can say, imagine the correct answer was this green thing, and you clicked over here in this red spot. We can call that a minus 20-degree error using the angular distance on this wheel. If you instead click up here, we could call it a plus 20-degree error. And if you clicked way over here, we could call it a 180-degree error. And so we could now make a histogram of the errors you make in this task. If we give you hundreds of trials of this, we make you do this over and over and over again for an hour, and we could quantify how accurately you can remember this simple perceptual shape information. If you do that kind of task with any visual feature, really, shape, color, orientation, face, structure, you will find error patterns that look something like this if you give someone a bunch of these trials, hard trials, like with 6 items to remember. This plots error. So 0 is good. 0 is what you want to be true, because that means you reproduced it exactly. And you'll notice there's errors all the way out to negative 180 and positive 180. And when you look at this distribution, this is pretty typical. What you'll find is a bunch of errors near zero. So that's good. That means they got a lot of trials correct. But also this very long tail of lots of very wrong answers. People looked at this distribution and they said, hey, it kind of looks to me like there's two processes going on here. And then this, spot. And okay, so the idea here is there's a lot of richness here. There's a variance in how peaky this is and the height of the tails and all sorts of structure about the internal representation people seem to have access to in reproducing this. People looked at this and they said, this looks to me like two things are going on. Like there's a bump for items I did remember. And then there's something like items I didn't remember at all, where I'm forced to randomly guess. There's a paper in Nature in 2008 that started a whole world of people studying mental representation by fitting these mixture models to these kinds of error distributions, saying, look, we can do this task and we can turn it into two things. We can turn it into how often they were forced to guess, so the mixture component of the uniform distribution, and the precision of the items they did remember. So something like the standard deviation or concentration parameter of this von Mises. This is a circular distribution, so people use circular normals, but it doesn't matter much because the normal part's right in the center. And they said, look, we can take memory, where you might previously have just said, do you remember this or not, and gotten a binary response. And we can turn it into this rich psychophysical distribution, and we can fit these models and we can measure two things: how much they know, like how many things they know, and how precisely they know them. And this task, if you give this task to people at different, numbers of items like I did to you, if I ask you to just remember one shape, you'll find that you don't find these long tails, that you just find a pretty precise distribution right near the right answer. You mostly always know plus or minus a few degrees. If I give you 3 items to remember, you'll start to find that this distribution gets wider. It's less precise at the center. And also you start to get these long tails. And then the thing that they said in this Nature paper was what happens if you go from 3 items to 6 is that all that seems to change is the height of that uniform distribution. The tails get higher. And they said, look, this is exactly what you would expect if people can only remember 3 items, right? The 3 items they remember look like this. And when you add 3 more, they just turn straight into guesses. And that uniform distribution gets higher. And so they published this mixture model, and they said this is proof that people can only remember 3 items in working memory, which I think is a beautiful result, like using this kind of method. A result I don't believe at all, and I'll convince you is not true, but a beautiful result, as probably Nature papers in your field work that way too. People took this task and they said, well, look, we can make people do continuous adjustment circle tasks in all sorts of domains. So here's data from a paper of mine where we did a backward masking. What this means is we flashed up that little oriented grading for 16 milliseconds, so 16 thousandths of a second. And then we flashed right afterwards, we put up a bunch of like moving stuff to make it almost impossible to see, almost but not impossible to see. And what you find if you do this and you present this for a longer amount of time, say 64 milliseconds, still very short, is people are quite accurate at this task. They seem to know the orientation most of the time. What happens if you switch to 16 milliseconds is, again, that same thing where it feels like what happened is mostly that you added guesses. And so the literature started saying, look, this mixture approach is also evidence that conscious awareness is discrete. You either see it or you don't see it. And that feeling of seeing it or not seeing it corresponds to the true information you have access to. So conscious awareness as discrete was the title of another famous paper about this. The same thing happens in long-term memory. I show you a whole bunch of items. I ask you much later to report the exact color of the couch you saw. You can do the same psychophysical task here. If you show me that item only once a day ago, I might have a lot of guesses in that distribution. If you show it to me 8 times a day ago, well, that eliminates the guesses, and now I seem to always know the information. Well, this is the kind of psychophysical task that people have applied all over the place. And this idea that we can distinguish changes in the precision of remembered items from changes in how many items are represented in your mind and how many turn into guesses is present in something like 2,000 papers in the literature on attention, iconic memory, which is very short-term memory, working memory, long-term memory. The idea that only how many things you can remember, but not how precise you can remember them relates to intelligence. Papers by people like me saying that your ultimate precision is the same in different memory systems, lots of ideas about consciousness, all of these ideas coming from this mixture approach. And I was fully on board with this approach, so much so that the toolbox that people use to fit these models, this MEM toolbox, I wrote the toolbox that people use to fit these models. So the broad claim is that items are often lost from perceptual awareness and memory and are all or none in a discrete manner. We can see this in these error distributions from this psychophysical task where we try to measure representations precisely, and these items sort of get lost and turn into guesses, and we can measure that. What I'll tell you instead, I think, is going on has to do with that high dimensional representation idea and simple decision models. You'll notice in those tasks, we didn't really have a model of how people were making decisions. We were just sort of taking as truth that these error distributions can be partialed out without really having a decision model of how they got to those distributions. And what I'll do is I'll sort of tell you two parts. First, I'll tell you that the most important thing to understanding memory is going to be understanding perception. You have to first understand how people represent these stimuli at all before you can study how memory corrupts those representations. And second, that you need some decision model, and we'll use this signal detection approach. And the claim that I'll make is that these tasks all tell us a lot more about the geometry of the stimulus space than about any given stimulus representation. And I'll unpack that. The idea of psychophysical scaling is going to relate to this population coding and representational geometry idea. It also relates to this idea of similarity, and we'll talk mostly about the later two of those. Okay. I'll use color as my main case study for the next few minutes. So imagine you think about color. You probably know there's like these color spaces. Like your computer has some color space, RGB or something. We don't think RGB maps very well to what's in your mind. Instead, we often use something called LAB, where L is luminance. This is a fixed L slice, so the luminance of these is supposedly the same. It's probably not on your projector. And these vary in two color components, A and B. And you could have a higher L and a lower L slice, right? Like brighter and darker. The way we do color reproduction studies, like the ones I mentioned, are we draw a little circle through it. And we use that circle as the possible colors to show and the possible responses. So we create a circle. And then we like this way of thinking because we know that like a small step over here is about the same discriminability change as a small step over here, because that's how this color space was created. It was created from human perception judgments. And the interesting implication of that is that you might assume that this space is sort of linear, and we can think of errors on that line of, 20 degrees is twice as much as 10 degrees as linear. But actually, that doesn't follow. It turns out that the high dimensional geometry of that space need not be the same because local judgments are all the same. Here's the kind of psychophysical task we use to measure the actual representational structure of these stimuli. So here's a color. Here's two targets. Which one is closer in color to that one? Hopefully you can immediately get the intuition that the right color is closer than the left one. Same task, which one is closer in color to that color? Again, you probably can tell the right color is closer. Now, which color is closer in color to this color? Probably you're like, I don't know. And you're trying to imagine that circle and you're trying to do some reasoning. It's a hard task. The interesting thing about that fact that that's hard is that this target color is that these two choices are 30 degrees apart on this color wheel. And these two choices are also 30 degrees apart on that color wheel. The only difference is that these two are close to this one, and these two are far from this one. So even though these are 30 degrees apart, this task is not equally easy just because these are 30 degrees apart. In fact, even though it's locally true that the color steps here are equal stepped, the global structure doesn't reflect that at all. The high dimensional representation of this is much more complicated. We can take performance in this task, we can fit a little decision model to it. I won't tell you about that particular model. And we can try to figure out for this green target, what is the distance, the internal distance of people to these items. So we'll call this the psychophysical similarity. So because it's psychophysical, because we ask people to make judgments psychologically of physical distances. And what you can find is a function that looks something like this, that is sort of falls off quickly and then is pretty flat. What that reflects is that the task near the target, so near green, you can easily tell apart two things that are 30 degrees apart on the x-axis. So this y internal distance must be large. Whereas for these two over here, they're basically the same internal distance to this target, even though they're 30 degrees apart, again, on the x-axis here. And we can do this for all the colors in this space, and create a map. So white here is more similar, black here is less similar, of how each color relates to each color in terms of this perception task, right? This is basically a perception task that's just mapping the representational structure of these stimuli. And for any given, line through it for green, it might look like this. But of course, it has some structure that's not quite perfect, right? Like there's color categories and things that make this not quite a perfect, like, equal line. But they all fall off quickly. Okay, so we can think about that first, the internal structure. And then we can think about the simplest possible decision model that people apply in psychology. Maybe many of you have seen this kind of thing before, just signal detection theory. The simplest signal detection theory case is when you give someone a force choice. So imagine I show you that purple color over there. I can't quite reach that far. That purple color over there. And then I ask you, which of these two things did you see, green or purple? How do we conceive of this decision process? We'll often conceive of it as having some x-axis here that I'll call memory match signal. And we'll say things you didn't see have, on average, 0 memory match signal, just in arbitrary units. But with some standard deviation, that is, sometimes things you didn't see feel kind of familiar. That would be this way. Sometimes they don't. And then on average, things you did see, like the purple color, get shifted rightward in memory match signal. That is, they elicit on average greater memory match signal. And we can parameterize that by how many standard deviations to the right they're shifted. Because this is a totally arbitrary space. The only sort of unit we have, we just sort of assign new things you didn't see to 0, standard deviation to 1, and then we just say how many standard deviations rightward are things you did see shifted. This is a standard decision model, and you can think of it in terms of normal distributions, and then you just end up with a simple, norm CDF decision rule. Or you can think of it as, like, on a given trial, like you get a sample from these two. And so you say on one trial, you might get a sample from here for green and here for purple. And you say, okay, purple has a higher memory match, so I'll pick that. And then every once in a while, you'll get a higher sample from green than purple. And we can just calculate that. And then therefore, we can go backwards from how often you get this right to what D prime was, what the shift in memory was. This is like the null hypothesis of decision-making in human decision-making models, basically. It's like the world's silliest decision model. It's approximately Bayesian, depending on how you think about the representational structure. And the insight here, the whole insight that led us down this pathway of rejecting these mixture models and thinking about this alternative approach, is basically to just think, well, how would you model it if you gave people that purple color and then you gave them these 4 alternative force choice tasks? So which color did you see? Did you see the light green, the dark purple, the light purple? And this is pretty simple change in the task structure. How would you think about this, though? Well, obviously, people are going to pick the dark purple more often than either of the greens, right? So when you think about this, you have to think that, like, on average, the memory match signal, the y-axis here, is going to depend on the distance in the color wheel from what you encoded. The green one's far away, so it doesn't get any shared memory signal. The purple one is what you saw, so it gets the most. And of course, another green one is also far away, so it's going to get no shared memory signal. And the dark purple is right next to it, so it's confusable. It's going to get a bunch of shared activation from having seen the light purple. And then when you write that over here, you're going to put the dark purple right at 0. It doesn't have any familiarity on average. It's just random noise. But the dark purple color here, you're going to have to think of as shifted rightward. It's shifted rightward by some amount, maybe not quite D prime, but it's got on average, it's going to elicit more familiarity than something you didn't see at all that has no relationship to what you saw. And then the question is, okay, where do we center this dark purple distribution? Like, what's the height for this dark purple? And you might think to yourself, well, we just did that psychophysical task. Maybe we should take this row of that psychophysical task and we should put it here. And we should say that we can do a perception task and figure out how much shared memory activation two things are going to have. The amount they're going to have is going to be based on that same, on average, how much overlap is there 10 degrees apart or 30 degrees apart on this wheel. And then you can think to yourself, okay, this task we usually give people, where we give someone a whole color circle, that's effectively a 360 alternative force choice task. There's each little degree here is a choice. Each degree is therefore going to elicit some memory signal. there's going to be some distribution associated with how strong those signals are on average. And we already have mapped out where we should center all of these distributions. And then on a given trial, of course, I'm going to have some colors feel more familiar and less familiar. And this is basically our way of thinking about this. It says take the null hypothesis of human decision-making, signal detection theory, do basic psychophysical scaling stuff that you could have done in the 1920s, combine those two, and try to explain all of those tasks. Formally, effectively, in this forced choice task, people are going to choose the thing that elicits the maximum memory signal. The memory signals are going to be this function we'll call fx, this psychophysical similarity function, scaled by d prime. So the higher your d prime, the more you're going to shift upward all of these points. And then there's going to be some noise, normally distributed noise. Now, the normally distributed noise part, there's going to be some covariance structure. That's, of course, because if I think color 99 is really familiar, I'm not going to think color 100 is like completely not familiar at all. Like that would be crazy. I can't even tell those two apart perceptually, right? And so you have to somehow make the noise here correlated. You can do that either by just using fx as your correlational structure. That works fine. What we did in this original paper is we made people do a perceptual matching task with the two things on the screen at the same time. And we said, if you can't tell them apart, they have to have correlated noise. And we use that. It doesn't matter that much. And of course, you can relate this to a bunch of other decision models. We have this paper about how this relates to loose choice models and other stuff with my postdoc, Maria. And it's got all the like derivations for those of you who are all about the actual math, but for now, I'm going to leave it at this. Okay, how do we think about this? We think on a working memory trial, you start having seen nothing. All the colors are therefore not familiar to you in this context. You see this color, it elicits an activation pattern. If d prime is 3, then we shift this up by 3, and these means of these are shifted up by an equal amount. We then add noise. We add correlated noise to that. During the delay, your memory is corrupted by noise. We end up with some internal representation that looks like this. This is the samples from those normal distributions on this trial, or the signal corrupted by noise equivalently. And then you take the maximum and you report that as your answer. And we can think what happens when you do this over and over again. If your d prime is 0, so you have no signal and you have a bunch of noise, then of course, which one is the maximum relative to the thing you actually saw is going to be uniform. If you have really strong signal and a tiny bit of noise, then of course, the only ones that are ever going to win and be the highest are the ones that are very high on the signal distribution. And so you're going to end up with no long-tailed errors, just right near the right answer is the only way you can ever be the max. But these middle ones, of course, end up with something like these long-tailed error structure. They end up with that because the signal adds only to the peak, but the noise adds everywhere equally. And so you end up with sometimes the maximum signal coming from out on the tail because the noise is sort of greater than the signal. And so as you change d prime, just this one knob of what's the strength of that distribution for the thing you actually encoded, you end up predicting the shape of all of these ideas. And you'll notice that's a 1-parameter solution to what was framed as a 2-parameter problem, right? So the claim in the literature was that there's 2 knobs here. There's how often you remember it and how precisely you remember it. And we're saying, no, there's just 1 plus a fixed structure. So the idea is that there's only 1 knob, not 2. And of course, for different stimuli, you're going to have different psychophysical structures, and therefore you're going to predict different error patterns. So here's 2 random face wheels. We sampled these from StyleGAN, made up a face wheel arbitrarily, made people do this task. And when we do those psychophysical tasks on these, where white is most similar and black is least similar, and I'm showing all the faces against all the faces here, we end up with very different structures, and they're not even that well behaved because we sample these randomly from StyleGAN. So there's some structure here where it thinks all of these faces are pretty similar all the way across, for example. And we can take a slice through that, and we can say for that face, here are the amount it overlaps psychophysically. For this face, here's the amount it overlaps psychophysically. We can now predict from that what error distributions are going to look like for those faces, right? So at d prime 1 for this face wheel, at that face plus noise, you're going to end up with errors that look like this. With d prime 3, you're going to end up with errors that are precise for this wheel, but not so precise for this wheel because these are all less similar than these, right? So you get this whole structure prediction for novel wheels. Okay, does this work? We call this model TCC, target confusability competition. It's not important. I'll probably say TCC because it's what I'm used to. We can do a whole bunch of working memory tasks where we vary a whole bunch of things. So here's that reproduce a color task with 1 color, 3 colors, 6 colors, 8 colors. Here's the error patterns people get. The gray is the real data from humans. We have this psychophysical structure I already mentioned. We use that to fit these distributions with just 1 parameter, remember, instead of 2 or even 3 or even 4 in some of the literature. And you find beautiful fits between the model and the data here as you sort of maximize this D prime. We can do the same thing with faces. We can do more interesting things here because we have 3 different face wheels here. For each of those face wheels, we have a similarity structure. That means we can take the similarity structure of this face wheel, we can fit human error and get D primes for when they saw 1 face in a working memory task, when they saw 2 faces in a working memory task, and when they saw 4 faces in a working memory task. These faces are very similar, therefore the errors are very bad. They're very spread. And now we can do a completely a priori prediction of what's going to happen on these. We know D prime for 1 face, we know D prime for 2, we know D prime for 4, we know the similarity structure for this independently measured, and now we can say we're going to completely a priori predict exactly what the error pattern looks like when I make people remember 4 things from this face wheel or 2 things. And that those orange lines are predicted a priori fits instead of fitting, they're predicted. And the same thing for this other face wheel. And so you can see this way of thinking that like there's some representational structure of the stimulus plus some noisy decision process lets us generalize across tasks in ways that you couldn't do if you were just thinking of this as a mixture of precision and guess or all those other ways. Of course, we can fit this to all those other tasks I mentioned. Here's the same thing when you do long-term memory tasks. I make you remember these couch color. I either show you the couch 8 times, 2 times, or 1 times, and then the next day I ask you what color it was. And the same thing works perfectly fine here, just assuming all that varies is D prime across repetitions. We can do the same thing with perceptual awareness. We can say that when you see it for 64 milliseconds, your D prime's high. When you see it for 16 milliseconds, your D prime's low. And you'll notice there's nothing there about awareness being all or none or discrete. We're just saying, look, decisions are noisy. They're based on the representational structure of the stimulus space. That's not to say it couldn't be true. There's some discreteness in there, but just you don't have to make any assumptions like that to fit the data, is what we say in this paper. Okay, so I'll spend a few more minutes talking about how this relates to population codes and geometry. Before I do that, I'll sort of wrap up the basic idea here, which is that psychophysical structure measured in just these independent tasks where we do perception tasks with humans, plus a very simple noisy decision-making model fits all of these data well. And in this view, all that differs among your representations is a strength parameter. You'll notice that's very different than thinking about memory as all or none. Instead, there's just like some how strong my memory is for every item parameter. And this way of thinking argues that the long tails of those error distributions are just a natural consequence of the structure of the stimulus space, not evidence of some separate guessing or failed representation process. We have a whole bunch of work on this now. We've been saying this for like 5 years now. And we say this accounts for working memory as a function of set size, and set size is how many you have to remember, the encoding time, the delay for different stimulus types, long-term memory with various ways of manipulating strength, degradation of perceptual awareness across like 8 paradigms. We can a priori predict different tasks. We can predict how well holding an item in mind predicts guidance of attention, all sorts of things like that. And we can use this to predict why people don't feel confident or why they feel like they're guessing in these tasks when there's 6 items, because usually in a signal detection model, you just think of the strength of the signal as your confidence criterion. So the stronger the signal elicited by a stimulus, the more confident you feel. So of course, when there's few items, if D prime is low, you'll often feel not confident. Okay, any questions about that?
Yeah, this is a good moment to ask questions, right? So I have a couple quickly. So one is these tasks that you described in the later half, showing the model, they are all of the structure of you present multiple stimuli and then ask people to freely choose from a response continuum, right? So
Yeah.
it was not, but when you motivated the model, you had the setup where you had multiple options and asking which of these multiple options fits the stimulus that was shown the best.
Yeah.
Have you tried it with the other one? Because to me, I find some intriguing things like in choice, the present the presence of two irrational choices may affect the fact that
Yeah,
the two colors may be similar, right? So I could
yeah,
suddenly start choosing between two, but if I have only two, I could choose a better one. Do you know where I'm going with this?
yeah, totally. Yeah, so I'm sure those effects exist. In our data where we do this, we do what we call this 360 alternative force choice little wheel task, mostly because it's what the literature has largely used to argue for these long-tailed guesses. Um, but even in this original paper, even in this 2020 Nature Human Behavior paper, we ask if we can transfer between tasks. So, for example, if I give you a two alternative force choice task, just like, did you see green or purple? In our model, that says that should be sufficient to measure D prime. And having measured D prime, we should now be able to completely a priori predict your error pattern if we give you the continuous reproduction 360 alternative force choice task. And we show a whole bunch of situations where that works perfectly, where you can transfer between those two tasks. My actual preferred task is actually that four alternative force choice I mentioned. The task where you give them like a purple and a different purple and a green and a different green. I actually have some data suggesting that that's like the task we ought all be using in this literature where we're trying to measure memory strength. It has the right idea in it that it demands perceptual detail, and it avoids ceiling effects when the task is easy because there's a hard choice, and it avoids floor effects when the task is hard because there's an easy choice, and it's easy to model the data. And so we have a bunch of data doing individual differences, and that's the task we prefer for that. But yeah, so we've done a whole bunch of transferring between different tasks, and in general, this approach works perfectly fine. That is, what you're measuring in 2AFC seems to be exactly the same thing you're measuring in these continuous reproduction tasks.
Yeah. Yeah, that is but the one thing I'm curious about is whether you get these
Yeah,
economic choice theory
yeah,
effects in this case, right? We're really fascinating if the green and the blue affect the
yeah.
perception of the purple.
Yeah, that's right. So we don't do so you'll notice I switched from a 2 AFC task to a 4 instead of a 3.
Yeah,
Because if you put purple, another purple, and green,
yeah,
you've created all sorts of strategic decision making about what
that's
you
right.
saw is probably the purple. So
That's
you
right.
have to add the other green. Um,
That's right.
in order to make it a memory task. Of
Exactly.
course, if you're interested in decision making, you might be interested in the effects of the similar lore. But in this case, it's gonna make the decision stuff affect the memory or stuff. So I think it's just a different set of questions, right?
Yeah. And a related question is this flattening in the tails. So
Yeah,
is there a not, you start off with a Gaussian. So the Gaussian in the tail
yeah.
is pretty slow slope. Is it basically that slope that is not visible? Or is there a nonlinearity from the max operation that kind of flattens it? Uh,
Yeah, both. Yeah, so the similarity structure, I don't have it on this slide. But the similarity structure is almost Gaussian in some of these, you'll notice, like this color thing almost looks Gaussian. It didn't have to be true, right? In the face spaces, it's not. It's weird looking, right? But in these task room, that's true. So this is almost Gaussian. Is that create the long tails, or does the fact that then you have a max create the long tails? Both, right? So this creates the long tails, but the max really peakies these distributions up, right? So the max is a huge nonlinearity operation we're asking people to perform here. You cannot do that. You can say, give me your confidence it was this color. And then you'll find this structure almost exactly like the data just look like this. And you don't have to deconvolve it with the decision process. Um, that's, I guess, similar to what
Perfect. Great. Thank you.
decision making and econ people do. But yeah, both.
Yeah.
And that's the key to transforming between tasks is effectively just undoing that max operation. The math gets real gnarly. The max of 360 uncorrelated signals is like, a whole bunch of integrating over all of the normal distributions. And once it's correlated, it's not doable math, at least according to our math department.
But
Um,
we can simulate, right? We can simulate.
um, the max of a sample of a correlated
Yes.
360 dimensional Gaussian is
Yes.
unknown. So we use sampling.
Cool. Thank
Okay.
you. Yes.
Okay, let me do this last part, the intuitions here, um, which is that the oh, did I get unpinned? Oh no, it was just me. Okay, no, I did. I got unspotlighted, I think.
I'm coming to respotlight you. Hang on. Okay, you're back spotlighted.
Cool.
Sorry about that.
Technical failures of using the weatherman approach. Okay, so the boring thing here is you just have a decision model. You have a max rule over some signals. And in some sense, the most interesting question for a psychologist is like, why do the representations look like this? Like, why is it that the results of that psychophysical scaling task, where I ask you which of these two things is more similar to that, looks this way? And I'll start by just saying that actually that task is almost unnecessary. If I literally just show you two colors and I give you a little Likert scale, 1 to 6, how similar are these colors? You get this exact same data. People's internal sense of similarity matches this scaling task result almost perfectly for many stimuli, for faces, for colors, for anything that's sort of high dimensional. When you make it like angles or orientation, that stops being true because people are like, well, I can literally see that it's half as much, so I will give it a half as much rating. And that's not what we're trying to measure. Okay, so there's this whole interesting math of the universal law of generalization, how generalization relates to similarity, and I won't tell you about it, even though it's fun. Instead, I'll move to the sort of geometry, population coding, why it looks this way. And I'll just give you the intuition that where we want to go back to is that intuitive models of memory idea, which is, it's pretty tempting if I give you an orientation to remember it's exactly vertical, for example, it's 90 degrees, that you think what's in your head is, I remember this was vertical. I remember it was 90 degrees, some point representation. And if this gets corrupted by noise, maybe it's going to shift this way or shift this way. And then when I ask you to report it, you're going to have some noisy errors there. And maybe you'll report 105 degrees. And it's sort of tempting to think about that as like the null hypothesis here is what should be true is that I have some Gaussian distribution and that when I have worse performance in a task, a memory task, a perception task, a awareness task, it should just get noisier. And this is the intuition that leads to these long-tailed errors being surprising, right? Like when I remember this thing as 90 degrees, error corrupts it in that like one-dimensional representation, right? Like I remember the angle, the number, and therefore people start appealing to other processes to explain these long-tail errors. And the alternative view that I pitched at the beginning is that, well, look, what we really think based on neuroscience is that when I remember this orientation right here, what actually happens when I perceive it is that it activates a whole bunch of tuning functions in V1. So I've got some neurons in V1. Some of them are tuned to this orientation. They get very activated by that orientation. Some are tuned to nearby orientations. They get activated a little bit. And the ones far away, none of them get activated at all. That is, I have a local tuning, which creates a certain geometry of the representational structure. And if I have this orientation and then I have this one over here, they're not 60 degrees apart like you'd think of in 1D. Instead, they actually create zero overlap. They don't activate any of the same neurons at all because I have this local tuning. And if you just plot as a function of how far apart these blue ones are, how much overlap there is in the sort of representational activation of those tuning functions, what you'll find is that this overlap as the degree of difference between orientations falls off in almost exactly the way I was saying that psychophysical representation falls off. That is, there's some sort of smoothness near the center because these distributions have some width, the tuning functions have some width, so there's some sort of local, like things only 1 degree apart just activate all of the same neurons. And then there's this almost exponential-ish fall off. Somewhere not quite normal and not quite exponential. It sort of depends on the way, how many of these distributions there are and how they're tuned. And this way of thinking that this is my representation of an item and that therefore this is the degree of overlap between the choices I'm presented basically gives rise to the same kind of representation structure. And you can start doing the whole geometry thing with this. So Jujin Wei just had a paper in PNAS doing this, where the idea is that for a given stimulus space, this color circle, we can measure this psychophysical structure. This psychophysical structure doesn't look so different from what you get out of just tuning function overlap. That is, tuning function overlap would give rise to basically this. Of course, measuring it in humans gives us the benefit that like, oh, like we sort of know that these greenish colors have a wider distribution than these pinkish colors, right? Like we don't have to assume some perfect geometry. We can sort of know this. And when we think about this matrix, we can, of course, show that in 3 dimensions. We can think of it as a geometry. Any matrix here implies some sort of geometry of similarity between the items, some distances, because this is effectively a distance matrix, similarity matrix. There's some exponential 1 minus transform there. And then you can say, well, look, this three-dimensional projection of this helps us understand these error patterns pretty well, right? If I see this pink color here, then you'll notice that nearby it in my representational space are all the other pinks, and everything else is equally far away. That is, the long-tailed errors are a natural consequence of the fact that everything else is equally far away from that pink color. That's why we've got this fold and this little manifold here, right? That's the 3D way of trying to make everything equally far away from this one. And so even though we're writing this as a color circle, you probably heard color circles before, the idea is that actually because of something like local tuning, your actual internal representation of this looks like this, which is more like a folded structure that treats everything that's far away as equally similar, as opposed to actually a circle. And the intuition about all those cognitive models comes from thinking about it as a circle. And once you start thinking that actually the internal representation looks like this high dimensional thing, then even in 3D, you can start to understand why the error patterns look the way they do. And you'll notice that one key insight here is that rather than thinking about the error for when I see purple, what happens as like, what is the internal representation of purple? What we did is we switched to understanding the geometry of the whole stimulus space. Like, what are the choices you're offering me being the primary determinant of the structure of this? And this idea is broadly what I was trying to pitch. But I will note that the idea here actually gives you a bunch of other interesting insights. Like, if you think that your internal representation of this color after some delay is a whole pattern of how much each of these colors match the high dimensional tuning function activation pattern you have, that is, this is a match signal of how much the actual representation matches each of these colors, then you might say that your mental representation of this is not just, I think it was green, the max, but actually I have a whole pattern of activation in my mind for this. Lots of people have argued in philosophy and other areas of psychology about whether we might have internal probability distributions as our representations. That is, whether we might have more than just a point representation or even a point plus my confidence. Instead, we might actually have this representation. And the model, of course, naturally not only argues we do, but makes quantitative predictions about the exact way people might have a richer activation function, that my mental representation of this might be, if it wasn't green, then it was surely this green, and if it wasn't that, it was surely red. Here's one way we've tried to study this. We give people a working memory task. There's some colors. We probe them on a color. We say what was here, and we give them a continuous report task. And then we give them a second choice response. We say, actually, okay, tell us again what it was. Here's only two choices. Notice the color wheel turned into just two choices. And we designed those two choices such that they're equally far from the thing you chose and equally far from the correct answer. So imagine the correct answer is here, and you pick this green one as your first response. It happens to be the max on this chart. Then what we offer as choices in that forced choice task is blue, the correct answer, and that's some distance away from the thing you chose. And then we take the thing that's equally far away around the circle, the other choice is equally far from what you chose, and we say, which of these two is it actually? So you chose green, and we offer you two choices that are equally far from green. One is the correct answer. And the idea is, if you think people just know it was green and they're not so certain about it, then they should be a chance in this follow-up task. But if you think actually people have this kind of internal representation, then they should often choose blue over red, because on average it will be more activated. And I'll ignore that. And what we find is, in general, that people are way above chance at this second choice response. So percent correct, 50 would be correct. They're at about 60% correct on this. And that's true regardless of whether they were accurate on their first response or inaccurate. That is, if they were in this long tail where the claim of the other models is they knew nothing about it, they had to guess, they're still at 60% correct in this follow-up task. So this is not only consistent with our way of thinking, but we can make quantitative predictions of exactly how accurate they should be at this second choice response, and they all pretty much fall out perfectly. So even though I asked you what color it was and you said green, actually our idea that you have this whole population in mind is helpful for predicting second chance responses. We can go further. We can ask people to do a really complicated report task where we give them a little Gaussian distribution. So you see a color, and then we say, okay, click where you think it was. This little Gaussian is what you put. And then you get to stack up more Gaussians. You get to stack up, I think, 8 little Gaussians. And at the end, you get money in proportion to how high the white part is at the correct answer. You can make some complicated reward models that I won't explain to you about what the optimal thing to do is here. But broadly speaking, if you just sort of ignore the reward structure here and just ask, can people stack these up? Does the way they stack them up look like this? The answer is broadly yes. And in addition, you can show some all sorts of interesting things that are consistent with having a whole probability distribution in mind and not just a point. Like their second response and their third response and their fourth response each provide an independent information about the correct answer. That is, for example, they're asymmetric towards the correct answer, which is more than would happen if all they had was, I think it was this plus a confidence signal. If you average just their responses, each one you average makes it closer and closer to the correct answer on average, as though there's independent information, all sorts of evidence that people actually have in their mind something more like a whole feature distribution, which is just falls out of this way of thinking. So broadly speaking, I guess the idea is if you think of the representational structure of a stimulus as being something we can measure in a perception task, broadly being motivated by the idea that it kind of looks like what you would expect from local tuning, that sort of gives rise to that, then that can help predict people's error patterns. This population way of thinking also motivates this idea that they should be able to give you more than just their peak. And that also is sort of broadly consistent with that. So there's some sort of whole circle here of a, I think, different mental model than like I remember it or I don't, that all connects. And of course, I showed you we can measure this behaviorally and then do these continuous report tasks. I already mentioned we can, of course, do other tasks here like 2AFC. We can also, of course, measure this using neural measures. We're doing that work now. You can use computational measures to measure these matrices instead of asking humans. So, for example, you can take a deep net and you can ask, does its similarity on average match humans? You can ask for these face wheels, for example, we can measure the similarity structure in human behavior. We can also do that with a bunch of deep nets. All of them you'll see approximately give rise to the same structure. What this means is we can take a bunch of a priori model-based measures of this and use them to predict human errors without even having to ask humans any representational structure. Okay, that's it. The idea of today was something like you probably thought that I've asked you to remember this color. You have some point representation in your mind that's either present or absent. I've tried to argue you should think of it like this, motivated by the sort of high dimensional intuitions that you get from these population codes ideas. Thanks to all my people. Have a good take.
Great. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Questions? You can unmute and ask if you have any. While we wait, I'll ask. I've been generally curious. So, is there any evidence from the literature or from your work that giving a report, that identifying one, affects the memory trace that you're holding? That a second report on a different slot is impoverished by the first one?
Yeah, yeah, that's true for sure. You can, for example, ask people to report multiple items on these working memory tasks. You can ask them to report all 6, one after the other. And you can even ask them whether they want to do it in their own order, like they get to pick which order, or you can force them to report it in order. You can then fit models to those and compare on the assumption that when they free report, they do it in their highest confidence to lowest confidence order, which is generally true. And you can therefore take those two things and ask how much forgetting there was, how much confidence differentiation there was, and all of those things.
I see.
Find interference effects, you find delay effects, you find a compound. You find that when people report, they tend to do it in like an order that suggests items are not independent, like we're modeling it here. If there happen to be 3 orangish colors, they report them all in sequence because they've chunked them. All sorts of other things that we model in other tasks.
I see. And all of that has been incorporated into your modeling framework as well, or are they still in the slot in the item framework?
So this particular approach that I argued for today is largely just acting like each item has some noise level, right? And we're just assuming the noise level is the same for all the items. Effectively, we're just treating this like an equal d prime for everything model and seeing how far it gets us. But yeah, we have lots of work using this broad approach to make models chunking and forgetting and confidence sorting. Paul Bays, who is another researcher who does this kind of neurally inspired model, has a bunch of work also along those line of thinking. It gets complicated fast, right?
Yeah.
Even for simple displays, like the ways people.
Yeah.
Yeah, the ways items affect each other are complicated very quickly, even for simple things.
Yeah. For the ones that you've chosen, the stimulus spaces, do you find any evidence for boundaries or certain specific features that are acting, cardinal directions or anchors or something like this?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, one sort of beautiful thing about this approach, I guess, is like for orientation, you obviously find huge cardinal and oblique effects. So people are much better at 90 and 0. When we measure that matrix, it just naturally has a much more precise similarity structure near 0 and 90. And that automatically predicts, like you just throw this basic model at it, and it predicts things like you get repulsion from near the orientations because you just have more similarity on the far away side than the closer side. So just measuring that matrix predicts all the things you get out of those often very complicated models. So we think that's like a real plus of thinking about it this way, that a lot of that just falls out. I didn't focus on it much here. I think I mentioned that the color matrix is not like a perfect line. There's some categories in there.
Super. So we have two questions, one from Miria.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much for the lecture. My question has to do, so I study population coding in sensory systems, so I'm on very much on the early perception end of things.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, you didn't talk much about how that population code that establishes the color that was perceived originally is then converted into memory and then compared at the memory level when you see it again. Can you just say, I know that's kind of a big question, but just touch on that?
Yeah, no, I didn't highlight that here for this audience, but yeah, I mean, one of the weird implications of this is that I am predicting your memory for the color of a couch you saw 2 days ago. And I'm saying that the right model of that is that we think about the perceptual task structure, like the population representation in a perception task, and then we just add noisy decision making, like the dumbest decision model on top. That's weird, right? Like the idea that your long-term memory can be thought of as this. For working memory, and perception people are like, okay, you're holding it in that population in V1 in mind, and so of course it looks like this. But no, it always looks like that. Even in tasks that don't superficially seem like they should have that population code structure. Yeah, no, that's one of the mysteries, that you can predict all of that stuff from this just like really dumb model, right? The model is just like, what if we just measure the similarity structure and then add noise, and it counts for even these other tasks don't superficially seem to depend on that. So yeah, we're interested in that. I mean, we're doing a bunch of fMRI work where we, for example, look at the face stuff where there's more room for interesting representations, and ask like whether the combination of sort of regions that contribute to that representation, like the right, you can get a representational similarity matrix from every region and ask whether like the combination of regions changes with delay, for example, right? So it might be that there are subtle changes, that is that like orientations become more categorical, for example, after very long delays, and that you can just get by sort of taking an averaged representation and predicting it. But that if you look closely, you will find that there's like a change in where they're coded. But yeah, the broad idea that you can think of memory is just like noisy perception, and that you can think of all the tasks that we've ever come up with as just noisy perception, like every task here, is weird, pretty weird. And of course I modeled these continuous reproduction tasks, but if the same thing works if you just do a regular psychophysics task, you can just apply the same model to a two alternative force choice or basic detection task. It works perfectly fine.
Interesting. Okay, well, cool. Thank you so much.
A simpler account than you might have thought was possible, I think.
One more question from Alex.
Yes, from the audience at QLS, go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk, especially I think the weatherman presentation format was super interactive, so thank you.
More engaging, I think, right?
Yeah, it's great, actually. So my question pertains to how we model memory as a distribution, which is what you're arguing. And you talked about how time is a corrupting factor to this distribution. Suresh mentioned perhaps that our choice of colors can be another corrupting factor. So I was interested in seeing if there are other corruption factors that kind of arose from your research, and more specifically, what can change such a distribution that you use to represent memory?
Yeah, so our like null hypothesis based on all this work is like we just start by saying, what if it was the exact same underlying similarity structure, and all that happened in all of these tasks was just they got noisier, that is D prime got lower. And that works when you vary everything we've ever thought to vary in a working memory task, like, I don't know, a dozen variables. And it works when you vary delay in long-term memory, you vary a number of repetitions in long-term memory, and a bunch of other tasks. And that's not to say that it couldn't be that other things matter. We're of course setting ourselves up. We're purposefully only testing what we see as memory questions. That is, we're not offering people 2 purples and a green. We're like trying to design tasks where what varies is the strength of the representation. But yeah, that's kind of interesting. One thing I didn't talk about is that you do these ensemble tasks. You show someone a bunch of couches, and they're all kind of greenish orange, and all the mugs are kind of purplish. And then you ask for the color of one of them, or you ask for the average color of the mugs. And the idea that it's just basically the sum of all of these distributions predicts that. We have a Nature Human Behavior paper about that. So that's the idea that you just take the activation in the population independent of which item it came from, for example. That's, yeah, I don't know. It's kind of weird. I think the fact that all you have to vary is the strength here works really well. There must be situations where you have to change the similarity structure, where like the actual representational structure changes, not just the noise. You can create such situations, like let's say for color, I just change the background color of the display. Then I'm going to change the literal perceptual contrast, and that's going to change that structure. But when you give people the same perceptual information to deal with, all the ways we've found of changing the task that don't change the stimuli seem to just be D prime changes.
But there's more work to be done on perhaps breaking down what happens in that D prime, because it captures all of it, right? All the noise, all the corruption is in D prime. Okay, very
that's
cool.
right. So that is delay adds noise, adding encoding time increases signal, but doesn't change noise. Like all these ways of like D prime is just a signal to noise measure, right? So it can be signal change, it can be noise change, but and where the noise comes from is like just an abstraction here, right? It's like if you had independent noise in each neuron in the population, then you would not quite predict this, but like, yeah.
Thank you.
Just to add to that, and so poorer performers just have more noise in their brains, right? In this.
More noise at this task. I mean, conceivably
Yes,
attention
yes.
changes this too. I mean, we have a bunch of attention data where if you attend something, you get greater D prime than if you don't attend it. So there's all sorts of modulating factors.
Great. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. And if there are no more questions, then we'll let Tim go. And thank you again one more time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Tim.